Imagine
Oh
stepping back into the
my
1700s
God.
on a plantation in the American South. A man works from sunrise to sunset, his body breaking down under the weight of impossible labor. Yet the data reveals something shocking. This same man, eating simple foods grown from the earth, had better heart health, stronger bones, and lower rates of the diseases that kill millions today. How is this possible? He had none of the medicines we have. He had none of the technology. He had none of the supplements. But he had something we have lost, something so simple we forgot it was valuable. And now, historians and scientists are piecing together forgotten records, old account books, plantation journals, and remaining seeds to tell a story that changes everything we thought we knew about health, food, and survival. This is the story of the foods that built a nation and the moment we abandoned them, with consequences we are only beginning to understand. There was a time in America when food meant something entirely different than it does now. When families gathered around tables, the meals they ate told the story of where they lived, what season it was, and what the earth had provided. In the plantation era, long before supermarkets and factories, food was not something wrapped in plastic on a shelf. It was not something that traveled thousands of miles in a truck. It was something that came from the ground beneath a person's feet, or it did not come at all. Historians who have studied the diaries and records of plantation life have discovered something remarkable. The people who lived during these times, despite the harsh conditions and difficult lives, had access to a stunning diversity of foods. Archaeological digs near old plantation homes have uncovered seeds and remnants of forgotten vegetables. Scientists have identified more than 300 varieties of vegetables that were being grown in American gardens during the 1700s and 1800s. Today, in the average American supermarket, you can find perhaps 30 varieties of common vegetables. The mathematics is staggering. We have lost 90% of the plant diversity that once surrounded us. A man or woman living on a plantation in Virginia might have eaten perhaps 7 or 8 different vegetables in a single week. A root cellar filled with turnips, beets, carrots, and parsnips, cabbage preserved in salt, beans dried and stored for winter, greens that were gathered from wild plants at the edge of fields, squash that could be stored for months, its bright orange flesh sustaining families through the cold season when nothing grew. These foods were not considered special. They were not discussed or celebrated. They were simply what people ate because they grew them. But when researchers have gone back and analyzed what these foods contained, the picture becomes clear. The foods eaten by ordinary people during the plantation era were packed with nutrients that our bodies desperately need. A single turnip contained more mineral density than most vegetables we eat today. The greens that people once gathered without thinking were loaded with vitamins and compounds that modern medicine now spends billions trying to put into pills. When people got sick during these times, they did not go to hospitals. There were no hospitals, not really. They used food as medicine. A person with a fever might be given a specific type of herb tea. Someone with a cough would be treated with a poultice made from mustard greens and other plants. Children's growth was supported by broths made from bones and slow cooking, practices that science only recently rediscovered and called by the modern name of collagen therapy. The data that historians have reconstructed tells a story that contradicts everything we have been told about progress and health. Life expectancy in the plantation era was lower, yes, but this was largely because of infectious disease and early infant death. If a person survived to adulthood, they had an excellent chance of living into their 70s or 80s. Arthritis was less common. Heart disease was rare. Cancer rates, when you could identify them in historical records, were fractional compared to today. The food was the factor, not medicine, not science, food. But this world of food abundance and variety did not last. Something happened. A shift occurred. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, this entire system of eating and living was replaced by something new. The seeds were lost. The knowledge of how to grow these vegetables was forgotten. The recipes and methods of preservation were abandoned. Gardens disappeared from yards. The connection between the soil and the table was broken, and the health of Americans changed with it, though we did not realize what was happening until decades had passed and the damage had already been done. The change did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when someone decided that Americans would stop eating nutrient-dense foods grown from diverse seeds and start eating processed foods grown for profit. It was gradual. It was logical from a business perspective. It made sense. When the railroad spread across America in the late 1800s, it opened a door that had never existed before. Food could now travel. A tomato could be picked in Florida and sold in New York. An apple from an orchard in Washington could reach a table in Boston. At first, this seemed miraculous. But the railroads needed food that could travel. They needed food that would not break easily. They needed food that looked good after days or weeks of transport. This meant that the varieties of vegetables and fruits that could survive journeys in boxes became more valuable. The varieties that were fragile, that bruised easily, that could only be eaten a few days after harvest, fell out of favor. A farmer making a living had to choose. He could grow the delicious heirloom tomato that tasted like summer and sold for good money at a local market, but which would spoil before it reached distant customers. Or he could grow a tomato that was sturdy, that would last weeks in a train car, that could be sold in larger quantities for less money per pound, but which would make him richer overall because of the volume. Most farmers chose the second option. They were not evil or foolish. They were trying to survive. They were trying to feed their families. The big seed companies understood this opportunity. They began to breed vegetables and fruits not for taste or nutrition, but for durability, for appearance, for consistency. They created seeds that would grow uniform produce that could be packaged, marketed, and sold in an identical way. Farmers who had kept their own seeds, a practice that went back centuries, began to buy seeds from these companies instead. The old varieties that had been passed down through generations were left unplanted. Without planting, the seeds were lost. Without the seeds, the knowledge of how to grow them, how to prepare them, and what they were good for, vanished. Agriculture consolidated. Small farms gave way to larger operations. Food production moved toward cities and became increasingly industrial. The people who ate the food grew further and further away from the people who grew it. A consumer in New York could not imagine that the tomato in their hand had been picked weeks earlier and had been treated with chemicals to ripen it. They did not know that the tomato had been bred to be red on the outside while still being picked completely green, that the red color came from chemistry and not ripeness, that the taste was secondary to everything else. But the bigger shift was happening at the level of nutrition. The soils where vegetables were grown began to be depleted. Industrial agriculture focused on producing yield, on growing more and more food, on making farming profitable for large operations. This meant planting the same crops year after year in the same fields. The soil gave up its nutrients. Chemical fertilizers replaced the complex minerals and microorganisms that had once made soil alive and rich. The vegetables that grew in these depleted soils looked normal. They were the right color. They were the right size. But they contained less and less of what the human body needed. A carrot grown today has a fraction of the mineral content of a carrot grown 100 years ago. Lettuce has less than half the iron. Vegetables have become larger, cheaper, more available, and paradoxically, more nutritionally empty. The foods that had sustained the people of the plantation era, the foods that had been the pharmacy and the fuel for human bodies, were being replaced by imposters that looked like food but were increasingly hollow inside. To understand what happened to American health, you have to understand what happened to American food. And to understand that, you have to look at the data, not the advertising, not the marketing, not the statistics that food companies publish, the real data, the records that sit in archives and county offices, the journals that historians slowly translate and analyze, the blood work and medical records of people who lived before the transformation and people who lived after. What emerges from this data is a pattern so clear and so undeniable that it seems impossible we have not been talking about it for the last 50 years. In the early 1900s, a researcher named Weston Price traveled the world. He was a dentist, and he wanted to understand why some populations had perfect teeth while others had decaying mouths and dental disease. What he discovered went far beyond teeth. He visited isolated communities that had not been touched much by modern commerce. In Switzerland, he found people eating the foods their ancestors had eaten for generations. In isolated parts of Africa, in remote regions of South America, in islands untouched by the industrial food system. In every single case, he found the same thing. The people had excellent health. Their teeth were perfect. Their bones were strong. Their children grew without the developmental problems he saw in industrialized populations. Their bodies were resilient. Disease was rare. And when he looked at what they ate, he found no supermarkets, no processed foods, no refined sugar, no industrial agriculture. He found people eating the foods that grew locally, that were nutrient-dense, that came from biodiverse farming practices. When he compared this to industrialized populations in America and Europe, the difference was stark. Children in industrial societies had crooked teeth, poor bone development, higher rates of infection and disease, and a general weakness that was becoming normal. The data that Price collected has been largely forgotten by mainstream nutrition science, but it exists. It is documented. It is irrefutable. Medical records from Plantation-era America show lower rates of heart disease and cancer, not because of magic, but because of what people ate. Court records and account books from plantation kitchens detail the foods that were purchased and consumed. These records show a stunning variety, a remarkable diversity, and an intentional focus on seasonal eating and preservation. Slaves on plantations ate many of the same foods as owners. In some cases, they ate better because they grew their own gardens and used every part of every plant, wasting nothing. Historical records from the period show that the health complaints of enslaved people were different from the health complaints of subsequent generations. The diseases of poverty and modern industrialization had not yet fully arrived. When disease came, it came from infection and injury, not from the slow breakdown of the body that we see today. The data shows that as food changed, health changed with it. The data shows that as food changed, health changed with it. As the 1900s progressed and industrial food became more dominant, medical records showed the rise of diseases we now consider normal. Diabetes appeared. Heart disease became common. Obesity began to spread. Cancer rates climbed. These were not entirely new diseases, but they were becoming epidemic. And the timeline matches almost perfectly with the timeline of agricultural transformation. When diverse foods disappeared, these diseases appeared. The correlation is so strong that some historians have become convinced the causation is obvious. We stopped eating the foods our bodies evolved to eat. Our bodies began to break down. It could not be simpler. Yet somehow, we have structured modern nutrition science to ignore this most basic fact. We have created a system where a food company can spend millions of dollars convincing people that a product that looks like food, but has been manufactured in a factory, is better for them than an actual vegetable. And that system has become so powerful, so entrenched, that the data showing what we have lost is dismissed as nostalgic, as romantic, as unable to account for other variables. But the variables do not matter. The data is clear. Before we changed what we ate, we were healthier. After we changed what we ate, we became sick. There is a reason that seed saving was such an important part of agricultural life for thousands of years before the industrial era. Seeds are not just seeds. They are information. They are adaptation. They are survival. When a farmer saved seeds from the best plants in his garden, he was not just preserving them for next year. He was capturing all the knowledge that had been learned about what grew best in that specific place, in that specific climate, with that specific soil. A seed of an heirloom tomato from Virginia contained within its genetics centuries of adaptation to Virginia soil and Virginia weather. A bean seed from South Carolina carried with it the intelligence of generations of farmers who had learned what would thrive in the low country. When people stopped saving seeds and started buying them from seed companies, something was lost that could never be fully recovered. The local knowledge disappeared. The adaptation to place was lost. The connection between a farmer and his land became abstract. The seed companies bred for uniformity and for qualities that did not matter to human nutrition or happiness, but which mattered greatly for industrial agriculture and profit. They bred for color. They bred for size. They bred for the ability to survive long transport. In doing all this breeding, they bred out the compounds that made food taste good. They bred out the nutrients. They bred out the resilience. They created seeds that could only survive with massive chemical inputs. Seeds that would not breed true, that would not produce seeds the next year that would grow the same plant. This forced farmers to buy new seeds every year. It was a brilliant business model. It was a tragedy for food and health. The knowledge of how to use these foods also vanished. Every culture that has ever existed has learned through generations of trial and error which foods heal which problems. Every grandmother knew which tea cured a cough. Every mother knew which vegetable made children grow strong. Every elder knew how to preserve foods in ways that actually increased their nutritional value. Fermentation was not invented by food scientists. It was discovered by people who understood through generations of observation that certain foods changed when left to sit in salt and their own juices, and that this change made them even more nutritious and able to preserve longer. The knowledge of how to prepare food for maximum nutrition was something that was passed down, mother to child, grandmother to grandchild, carried in conversation and practice, not in books. When the industrial food system arrived, this knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Fermented foods were thought to be old-fashioned. Preservation techniques were seen as unnecessary because food could be kept in freezers now. The slow cooking of bones for broth was replaced by quick cooking and commercial stock. The eating of organ meats, which are nutritionally superior to muscle meat in almost every way, was abandoned in favor of the same few cuts of muscle. The use of every part of an animal, a practice that honored both the animal and the nutrients it contained, gave way to throwing away anything that did not fit into the narrow conception of what meat should look like. All of this knowledge vanished within a generation. It was so fast that people did not realize what they were losing. By the time anyone thought to write it down or preserve it, it was largely gone. A woman who grew up in the 1950s in America would have almost no knowledge of how to preserve food the way her grandmother had done it. The skills died with the people who held them. This is the tragedy that no amount of modern convenience can undo. We erased the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, and we did it so quickly that we barely noticed. The story of the lost foods of plantation-era America is not a story about going backward. It is not a call to return to times that were harsh and difficult and limited by the technology of the day. It is a story about understanding what we gained and what we lost in our pursuit of progress. It is about recognizing that not everything old is good, and not everything new is better. The data that emerges when historians and scientists look carefully at what people ate before the industrial transformation is clear. Those foods contained nutrients. Those practices worked. Those systems, while not perfect, were far superior to what we have created to replace them. The irony that confronts us now is that the world is finally beginning to listen. Doctors are talking about inflammation. Nutritionists are discussing bioavailability. Scientists are studying fermented foods and discovering that the fermentation process makes nutrients more available to the human body. They are researching bone broth and finding that the collagen and minerals support joints and digestion. They are studying the microbiome and discovering that the diversity of bacteria in our guts requires diverse foods to thrive. Everything that people knew intuitively, everything that grandmothers understood through generations of observation, is being confirmed by modern science. But the confirmation is coming too slowly, and the industrial food system is too entrenched. Even as we learn that monoculture agriculture depletes soil and creates nutritionally empty food, there are more monocultures being planted. Even as we discover that processed food makes us sick, the food industry makes processed food more convenient and more dominant in the lives of people. Even as traditional seeds are being lost forever, the biggest seed companies continue to consolidate, buying up the seed banks and the knowledge of smaller companies. The story of the lost foods is also a story of a choice. Right now, today, in this moment, some farmers are choosing differently. They are going back to saving seeds. They are growing heirloom varieties. They are rebuilding soil through diverse farming practices. They are remembering the knowledge that their ancestors had. These farmers are proving, through their work, that the foods that sustained America before the industrial transformation can still be grown. They can still be eaten. They can still heal bodies and nourish families. The vegetables they grow are more expensive than industrial vegetables. They are smaller and more regular. They do not travel well, but they taste like something. They contain the nutrients that our bodies need. They are real food. The question that stands before Americans now is whether this knowledge will be preserved or lost forever, whether the seeds will be saved or allowed to disappear, whether we will continue on the path of industrial food or whether we will begin to remember what we have forgotten. The data from history is clear. The foods that were available to people in the plantation era and the centuries before that were profoundly better for human health than the foods we have created to replace them. The question is not whether we can afford to change. The question is whether we can afford not to.